Welcome to the Select Star Podcast, your resource for innovative technology, developer topics, and more. Here's your host, Margo McCabe from the HarperDB team.
Welcome to Select Star, your resource for innovative tech and developer topics. On today's episode from back in 2018, Stephen Goldberg, HarperDB co-founder and CEO, interviews Kirk Borne, the principal data scientist at BoozAllen, about everything from Astro Physics and windmills to 4D printing and autonomous lawnmowers, in their conversation to ultimately explain digital twin. Check it out and let us know your thoughts.
Do you mind giving just a quick sort of intro to who you are and your background and some of the things you've done?
Okay, how quick would you like that?
Whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Okay, so I'm Kirk Borne. My background is astrophysics. At a very young age, I decided I wanted to do something in science because I just loved exploration and discovery, and astrophysics was the thing that caught my attention. And all my years in astrophysics, I was doing work with data. So I was either analyzing data from experimental observations of the universe or creating my own data by running numerical simulations and computer models of things in the universe, for example, colliding galaxies. So when you run these numerical simulations, they generate lots of data, which it needs to be analyzed. So those were, I would joke with people that was my night job, my day job. I worked at NASA for 20 years, managing data systems for NASA's astronomy satellites. So I was always working around data, both in terms of my service work that paid the salary and my vocation as an astronomer doing research. All those years of doing that led me to see greater value in data beyond just the astrophysics, but everywhere in the world. Data sets and data volumes were growing enormously. And about 20 years ago, I sort of caught the bug of machine learning. I started discovering these amazing techniques and algorithms for finding interesting patterns and trends and behaviors in data, especially large data sets. And I guess from my birth as a data scientist came about 20 years ago, about 15 years into my NASA career. So did that for a few more years, then left NASA to teach this stuff at George Mason University. So I was actually a professor of astrophysics for 12 years at the university after my 20 years at NASA. And even though I was professor of astrophysics, I never taught astrophysics courses. I taught data science because my passion was to train the next generation in the tools and techniques of discovery from data. So it's always been about discovery from data. And then about 3 years ago, this company, BoozAllen Hamilton, came along and offered me a position I couldn't refuse. And so I uprooted myself from a tenured full professorship, and I am now the principal data scientist at BoozAllen Hamilton, which basically means I get to be the horizontally matrix guy. I can talk to anyone in any client space or vertical market or area where the company is doing analytics, advise people, advise clients, consult with clients, mentor the young data scientists, just go out and give public talks on this stuff, and also be very active on social media, where some of you probably have seen me, and if not, I encourage you to check it out, because on my Twitter platform, I tell people that's my micro education platform, where I continue to educate the world about these things that I love.
That's awesome. And I definitely am an avid follower. I would say you were my favorite follow. So I would encourage anyone who's listening to this to follow as well. It's probably the most informative Twitter feed if you're interested in machine learning, IoT, data science, any of the things we're going to talk about today. That sounds like a pretty cool job, getting to go across all the different verticals, looking at those problems, and that is certainly, I think, many people's dream job. So that's awesome. Today we were going to talk a little bit about digital twin, and obviously digital twin has an IoT component, it has a machine learning component, but for those folks who might not be familiar with digital twin, would you mind sort of giving your definition of that, which I think would be really valuable with your pure science background as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, a digital twin is not necessarily a twin of yourself, though sometimes people immediately jump to the conclusion it's like my virtual self or something like this. It could be that, but that's not really what it's about. It's really intended to be a virtual replica of a physical system. So the virtual replica normally is a physics-based model, which has all the characteristics, behaviors, responses, etc., that a real physical system would have. And when you actually build the physical system and put sensors on it and collect data from the real system, you can sort of mirror that in the virtual system, which is the digital twin. So whenever there's a failure mode or anticipated failure mode or a prediction of something going to happen, you can sort of play it through the digital virtual twin of the actual physical system to either forewarn yourself and take appropriate action to prevent that outcome you may not want, or if something does happen, you can actually replay the data, even from, take the actual sensor data from the physical system and play it through your virtual system, the digital twin, play it forward and backward and as many times in many different angles as you wish to see if you can do a root cause analysis and understand what's going on. So it's used during the design phase of physical systems as well as in the operational phase and the preventive maintenance phase and so forth. And so there's examples of this from the very early days at NASA. I wouldn't say necessarily that the Apollo 13 mission, which was the successful failure, if you know the story, of course, that the mission failed, but they got the astronauts back, so actually the mission was successful because that was the mission, getting these people safely back home. They just never made it to the moon. But they had they basically had mirrored systems on Earth that sort of replicated what was out there in space, so they're able to figure out what to do in order to get that crippled spacecraft back to Earth. But now we see digital twins in wind farms, so digital replicas of a wind power generator. We see it in sort of nuclear power plants, nuclear submarines. We see it entire manufacturing plants have a digital twin, or it could be something as small as maybe some kind of medical device that's implanted in your heart, for example. And so there's a digital twin of that sort of replicates what it's doing in your heart, and see if we can understand it with a digital replica of your heart with the same device virtually embedded in that virtual heart. So the scale can be anything, but the idea is that it combines the numerical simulation, computer modeling on one side, with the analytics and data collection and data understanding on the other side. That is, putting the two things together to achieve better outcomes from whatever physical system you're dealing with. And more often than not, it is usually a pretty significantly large physical system, like a spacecraft or a nuclear submarine or a wind farm out in the ocean, for example. So I know that some of the European countries have been working with some of the wind energy companies in their part of the world, where they have these huge farms of windmills out in the North Sea, for example, and they have digital twin technology to basically service them and understand them and predict when maintenance is needed without actually having to go out into the tossing seas and freezing ocean every time they need to check something.
That's a really interesting history of it. I like that you took it back to the NASA missions. I had never really thought of that. I've thought of it for other things, and I know the concept has been around for even longer than that. I think it was Einstein who came up with it originally. Isn't that right?
I don't even know, so you're informing me, so thank you.
I think he's the one who coined that phrase, but I might be making it up. I'll look at it afterwards. I probably should have Googled that quickly before this. But that said, you covered a lot of the things I was going to ask you, but that's awesome. And then one of the questions I had was, you touched on the verticals, and you touched on a lot of them, and there are definitely different verticals that are experiencing this, but which ones do you think it's going to cause the most disruption? Because while the concept's been around for a while, technology we have today is obviously making it much easier to perform these things. So which verticals, in your opinion, do you think will undergo the most disruption due to digital twin?
That's a good question, because there's so much disruption everywhere. Sometimes it's hard to say if you fall down hard or you fall down soft, you're still falling down. So I'm not really sure how to measure that, but I do think certainly in the digital manufacturing space, this is really huge in the sense that because the connection to IoT here, or the industrial IoT, where there's sensors on all devices, and so those devices in a manufacturing plant can signal sort of quality issues or anomalies or deviations in the manufacturing process. And so you can basically streamline the whole quality assurance program within a significantly large manufacturing facility without too much human intervention, because it's again, the data is coming off the sensors, and if the data coming off the physical sensors don't correspond with what you expected when you look at the simulation of that manufacturing system, then you get an early warning alert, if you will, because there's a deviation that's taking place, and so intervention can be taken. And sometimes that intervention, again, is almost like a servo feedback. So again, sort of minimizing how much human intervention is required, to further streamline that process. And so so I think digital manufacturing as a whole is what they call Industry 4.0, I guess, is extremely disruptive right now. Certainly in the power sector. I mean, when I've gone to a few smart grid, smart energy analytics type of conferences in the past year. One of the fun things I get to do as an astrophysicist, I get to go to conferences on topics that I know nothing about. But too, you can talk the common language of analytics and data science and machine learning, no matter what the actual vertical is, and that's the part I love about it, that we can have these conversations because they transcend those specific disciplines. So in those conferences, I'm hearing a lot of talk about digital twin technology. The wind farm is one example. Electric power grid is another example. Just how do you basically model power grids? And there's lots of discussion about resilient power grids and how do you reconfigure one when a section of it goes down, and having a digital twin of the system to know how to reroute power when, say, some section of it goes down because of a storm or something. And because we are now, with smart meters, able to have very high resolution, both in time and space, of where energy is flowing, unlike the old days where you basically had the meter reader come to your house once a month, and they had a monthly reading. All kinds of bad things can happen in those 30 days between that reading. But now they have a few minute resolution everywhere, even within a single facility, a building. There's sort of power readings coming every 15 minutes or so from all the different places in a building or a manufacturing plant or an assembly plant or whatever. And so you can start rerouting power, but that's sort of a scary proposition unless you really know how it's going to impact the load on the system, especially if it's a load that's caused because of an adverse weather event, then the loads are going to be changing because of that. So all kinds of predictive modeling goes into this. And the best way to play in that space is to have a virtual simulation of the real power grid. Say, what would happen if we did this? Oh, okay. What would happen if we did that? Oh, okay. And so before you get out there and start rerouting things, you have a pretty good idea what the response of the system is going to be, because you've built this high fidelity physics-based model of the system. So in the energy space, I think this is a really significant disruptor because of the way we're going to have to be more careful in how we use energy, partition energy across different places. The energy days, hot summer days where you change the way that people are able to use energy, and the pricing changes to induce and nudge people to change the way they use energy. And all that can be modeled in advance to see if particular actions are going to be beneficial. So those are just some examples, and again, we can go on and on with healthcare and all kinds. Remote sea exploration, deep space exploration, nuclear submarines. It's amazing, and because my background is both computational science with all those galaxy models I used to build, and data science, to me this is sort of like the confluence of all the things that I've always loved happening in one place.
For sure, and I think that if you look at IoT, you look at where data science is, you look at machine learning, you look at some of the things going on with connectivity and networks, some of the things going on with hardware. It is sort of perfect time and space for digital twin to really come to life. I mean, it is an old concept, but now we can sort of do it in, like you said, in a more high resolution way where it has more value. And I think that that makes it really exciting, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about it today. But at the same time, there's also some challenges that we still have to face. Are you seeing any that are specific in terms of the projects people are trying to tackle, or any certain areas of their architectures or issues that are kind of common across industries?
So one thing which sort of surprised me when I had this conversation at this smart electricity grid workshop a couple of weeks ago was people were starting to talk about 5G. Yep. So let me back up just a second, then I'll get back to the 5G story. But just as you were just referring to, this sort of convergence of all these different technologies, and I like to use the word confluence because they sort of blend together. Just like rivers, a confluence of rivers, where the two rivers merge, and you have a stronger force because of that, that blending of the two. And so, if you think about cloud and edge computing, which are sort of almost opposites, but you need to have that blended in an IoT environment because sometimes you want to do the computation at the edge at the point of data collection, and then in other cases you want to bring the data back from the sensors. For example, in that digital twin environment, you have to bring it back to the place where you're doing that virtual simulation to see if there is deviation from what you expect. So cloud and edge computing, as well as sensor technology, machine learning, data science, all of those things, all that stuff is happening. And then you got this other thing, which is the communication piece, which is the 5G component. And I never really thought too much about 5G. I mean, I'm not a communications engineer, so it just sort of like happens. I don't think about it. But someone was saying that basically it's such a I don't know what the right word is, the increasingly small activity on the transistor, on the electronic chip, where all this sort of wireless communication stuff is happening, and so you get that higher bandwidth because you have much smaller separation between the components on the transistor to allow you to have higher frequencies and more, sort of narrow bands, so you can actually increase the number of channels in a band. And they're saying what happens is that when you get things at that level is individual cosmic ray events. So in astronomy, we're very familiar with this, where energetic particles from space, usually from the sun, hit electronic detectors and cause some kind of electronic discharge. Well, but normally we don't notice that on Earth-based systems, but we notice it all the time in astronomy because we're detecting very, very, very faint light sources in space, which with these electronic detectors, and if there's a sudden electronic discharge on your detector, how do you know it's from one of these solar proton events or cosmic ray events or from space? Well, all of a sudden, this thing which I thought was only important in astronomy is now important in 5G, because if you disrupt one of those micro transistors in that device, all of a sudden you're transmitting a different number, a different signal from your sensor to home base or vice versa. And it's like, oh, so sort of the fidelity of the data then has to be rethought. I mean, so when you think about data transfer protocols, there's always like all this sort of handshaking that goes on when you transfer data, which most people don't think about, the TCP/IP type of stuff, where you basically, you send a packet, and then the receiver says, yes, I've received this packet, and there's some kind of a byte check or a checksum or something that verifies that it got the right packet, and then it just goes back and forth. And in the big data world, we have these other data protocols, like I think UDP is one of these, where you send bigger chunks of data, so you're not checking every individual packet, so you're able to transfer more data. But all of a sudden they're saying, okay, well now we need to be really careful again at the fine grain level if something has been disturbed or because of this electronic impulse that happened on the chip at a very micro level, because we're now really moving the communication circuitry down to this microscopic level. And wow, I was just like hearing this conversation, and I said, this is unbelievable that things that I sort of worried over and fussed over my data for decades in astronomy when I had these energetic signals particle signals in my data, which were not real data from space. It was just some discharge in the sensor. Now, if we had those discharges and sensors, could actually impact things we're doing at a human level, as opposed to outer space, universe level. So it's. I think that's in itself is a challenge because
that's really scary. I didn't know that.
We're moving lots. Yeah, we're moving lots of data around. That's really the point. The point is we're moving lots of data around, and the integrity of that data must be assured when you're doing all that.
I consider myself to know a little bit about IoT. We're pretty heavily involved there, but I had no idea. That's pretty interesting to me. And one of the other things you mentioned, that sort of, really impacts connectivity in a way and reliability. And then one of the things you mentioned was around edge decision making. And to me, while I didn't know the 5G side of it, I do know that throughput can be an issue sometimes, that connectivity can be an issue sometimes. And so one of the things we talk a lot about is, edge decision making and pushing your decision making capability to the edge from the cloud. Use the edge for what it makes sense to do, and use the hardware you already have for kind of to its full extent, rather than just having a dumb edge that shoves stuff to the cloud. But I guess in that case, edge decision making becomes even more important when you could potentially have faulty data coming back to the cloud. But I guess in your mind, where are some of the areas where you see edge decision making as important? Because while we talk about it a lot, people don't. I think people are still learning about and trying to find those modalities and architectures and patterns of when to make decisions on the edge. What are you seeing as sort of valuable places where it makes sense to make those decisions?
Yeah, very good question. I do want to have a disclaimer that my previous comments. Again, I'm not a communications engineer.
Understood.
So certainly nothing in the way of knowledgeable too much about 5G. So if I said something wrong and there's a 5G engineer out there saying, Kirk, you're saying all the wrong stuff, then I please hope someone corrects me. But so I don't want to overplay the
no
data.
worries. I don't know that much about network either. So I think between the two of us.
I don't want to overplay the data integrity of It just surprised me that was coming up in the conversation. That's all. But coming back to that edge thing, for years, one of the things when I was my last years at NASA, so I worked at NASA until about 2003, so that was 15 years ago, and we were already talking about a concept called intelligent data understanding, and the prototype idea, the concept, or the demo, if you will, was like the Mars rover. So the Mars rover roves this little robot. Jeep sort of drives itself around Mars, and it takes samples of the soil, and it finds interesting things or uninteresting things, and it makes decisions whether to turn left, turn right, or stay where it is, or go back, or whatever. And so, in a sense, that's an edge decision right there. At the point of data collection, decide, is this a waste of time, or do I keep doing what I'm doing, or is it really important? Should I send information back to the human analyst right away, or can I just sort of packet it up and send it later if it's just informational and not an alert? So all those kinds of things, we can think of use cases on Earth. It doesn't have to be deep space. And so after I left NASA and started teaching at the university, I taught a course on generally data science. The course was called Scientific Databases, which allowed me to basically include everything in the world: data science, machine learning, databases, sensor technologies, bioinformatics, geoinformatics, health informatics, you name it. I crammed everything I could think of in this course, and my graduate students were overwhelmed usually. But I had a whole lecture on what in those days was called sensor networks or sensor webs. And the idea was that the smart dust, the sensor was basically had smarts in it. So you would sense. So NASA had this idea of sprinkling smart dust in a forest, for example, which would measure the temperature of the forest floor and alert somebody if all of a sudden the temperature rose quickly, indicating there might be a fire in some remote part of the forest where there's no humans around to see it, until all of a sudden it's this blazing inferno. And the idea was you don't keep sending signals back to the human analyst unless the temperature deviates from its nominal, room temperature, if you will. So the smarts on the machine said, okay, I don't need to send information now. I don't need to send information now. I don't need to send information now. That kind of thing. And so the sensor web technology was not just there. When you think about a robotic device of any kind, whether it's a robotic device that's sort of micro level, that's flowing through your blood to make some decision whether to break up a platelet in your blood or not, or whether it's a submersible in the ocean, or whether it's an army robotic unmanned vehicle or unmanned drone. It's making a decision to turn left, turn right, go up, go down, do something as a result of whatever data it's collecting in the sensor. So all of those things, whether macroscopic or microscopically, decision making at the point of data collection is critical. And like I tell people, for example, a self-driving car, same thing. So you have all these cameras on your car that's looking in front of you, to the side of you, and all around you, and all this stuff. And that's a lot of data. I mean, camera streaming video is big data, as we know. I just came home on an airline trip, and they always say on those airlines in the Wi-Fi, one of the rules is you don't do streaming video when you're on the airplane because they just don't have the bandwidth. So streaming video is a big data hog. So you can't send all that data from your streaming video in your car, self-driving car, back to some cloud somewhere, wait 15 minutes to find out whether or not, that was a person that was walking in front of you, you should have put the brakes on. Well, it's a little too late 15 minutes later. So you got to make that decision at the point of data collection of what the action is you need to take. So these kinds of things are all around us. And the most exciting, unbelievable one I heard of recently was something called 4D printing. Have you ever heard of 4D printing?
I haven't.
Well, when I first saw it, I thought it was a misprint, right? 3D printing, right? We're all familiar with 3D printing. And there's actually a TED Talk on 4D printing. So again, I encourage people to check it out. And I might misdescribe it, but I'll try here. So 4D printing, the fourth dimension is time. So imagine like a carbon nanotube, a device, a substance that can actually change its shape depending upon the sort of the electrical impulse or charge that's applied to different parts of it. So think of it almost like a piezoelectric crystal, that when you apply a different current across this node or that node or this diagonal or that side, it causes some current to flow. And in the carbon nanotube case, it causes it to change shape. Well, you can actually program a carbon nanotube to take a different kind of shape based upon the signal that comes in. So the example that the person described was, for example, a heart catheter. So a person has a heart catheter inserted in their major artery, keep the blood flowing in case that they've had some platelet problems or bypass surgery or whatever the reasons are. And that catheter actually needs to, or a stent, let's say a stent even, that makes more sense to me, a stent needs to change shape based upon your blood pressure, the stress, the blood flow, whatever. And so let's say you're in a stressful situation, all of a sudden your heart rate goes up, the blood pressure changes, your blood flow changes. That stent needs to behave differently. So there's a sensor in there that senses your stress level through the biometrics or whatever, and causes that stent to change shape through some kind of signal that's sent to it. So it's essentially printing out a new stent in real time from the data that's streaming from the sensor. So essentially printing, I use that word lightly.
Yeah.
It's creating an output, a shape that's dynamic in time based upon the inputs from the sensor. Now think about a digital twin in that environment.
For sure.
Where the streaming data says, I now need to take, like a windmill, I now need to change the pitch of my blades on my windmill under these wind conditions, or change the length of the blades. How do I change the length and the pitch and all that stuff of my blades in real time? Well, with 4D printing, you can. Now, okay, this sounds very theoretical right now, but I think it's moving beyond theoretical. It's pretty impressive. And so that's really at the edge. That's at the edge. At that point of data collection, you make a decision to change the shape of something.
That's pretty incredible. I mean, that I did not know that either, and I've never heard that term, but it makes a lot of sense. And just for people listening, I did Google that while we're talking, and it is real. I believe you, Kirk. That sounds very Star Trekky to me. So I just wanted to ensure that it's yeah.
Well, it does sound like a Star Trek replicator.
For sure, or Star Trek clothing, or I mean, there's my mind is racing right now. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the silly little model I had in my head is I don't know if you ever watched the Harry Potter movies, but there's one movie where the bus has to like shrink in width because it's going to try to squeeze between two other buses on the road. And so, in a sense, in real time, it changes shape to fit through the space that it has to fit through, and then it goes back to its normal shape after that narrow passage.
That's I mean, there's a million different things, and I think what you touched on about like. For me, I think edge decision making is when you have some sort of mission critical system that needs to take some form of reaction, whether it's life saving or something, even like the bus. I mean, or in the heart scenario, or like a oil and gas scenario, with we need to shut off something, or in a manufacturing plant, and you need a self-contained system where you want to be able to respond. Reliably 100% of the time, so you need that capability. But I think what you're taking is a step further beyond, where it's not just alert and respond, but literally you could have a digital twin on the edge that takes action, which I was going to ask you, my next question was going to be, and my final kind of wrap up, I was going to ask you about sort of where you see the future of digital twin going, but I think you've taken us there quite nicely. But beyond that, is there any other sort of, before I let you go, any other sort of exciting things you see happening in the future with the digital twin?
Well, if I could speculate, I'd say 5D printing, but let's not do that. Because that would really be a fantasy world at that point.
Yeah, that would blow my mind.
But I think you really hit the nail on the head here, in the sense that the decision at the edge analytics or the edge computing, again, it's really a mission critical decision. I think that this goes back to sort of the first way you phrased the question: what are the use cases? What are the applications where that's necessary? And I think it's almost like when you know, right? You don't need to invent an excuse to have edge computing. You just know that I need to make this decision as soon as I have collected the data from my sensor. I can't send it back to a cloud or some compute environment to let me know what to do next, or let my bot know what to do next, or let my system know what to do next. It needs to take that action in real time, or pseudo real time. I mean, as fast as the electrons allow you to make it, basically. And so I think the future will be, I guess, we'll probably be. I mean, I'm just speculating here. I'm not a technologist in that sense, but I certainly expect to see more of these kinds of technologies in our day-to-day lives. I mean, again, I'm not sure of examples of that, but I can imagine, things that sense something is happening and then take some appropriate action. And so I think the smart grid is an example of that, where we're going to see more activity around sort of sustainability of our electricity supply and things like that being enabled, by sort of real-time dynamic repartitioning of the grid or whatever. And it's things like that, which seem like it's so invisible. How will we even know that? But I mean, in terms of the long-term sustainability of our energy system, I think it'll be a huge thing. Certainly manufacturing, I think we're going to see sort of a lot more stuff in this area. Now that sort of people know that there's such thing as 4D printing, maybe you're going to start seeing more experimentation in that area, where people are going to start trying things, whether in the medical device field or mechanical devices. I'm not good at like futuristic thinking of some way out of the box thing that might happen, like my lawnmower suddenly changes into a helicopter or something like that. But I think a sensor. I mean, okay, I'll take my lawnmower as an example. So I have a self-propelled lawnmower. That if the future lawnmower has some kind of sensor on it that detects I'm about to run over a rock, because there's some kind of visual sensor right at the LiDAR or something right off the front of the lawnmower. Just before I roll over, it says, "Oh, you're about to roll over some obstacle that's going to destroy the blade of your lawnmower." It does, it takes some kind of action, whatever it might be, retract the blade a little bit or something in response to that. So sort of like, sort of the trip hazards we have in our homes and in our day-to-day lives, those kinds of things, maybe sensors will start sort of helping us to navigate around those sort of subconsciously, virtually, without even realizing.
For sure.
I don't know. Maybe things like this will happen.
Well, the crazy thing is, I don't think that's 5-6 years ago, that would have sounded very futuristic. I don't think that is even, in a weird way, that's not that futuristic of a use case right now. You know what I mean? It is and it isn't, because there's, compute challenges that need to be solved at scale, like putting the level of compute that you might have in a Tesla, for example, that can handle that similar use case today into a lawnmower that becomes affordable, something that you can buy at your house, is where probably a lot of that challenge is. But the technology behind it, the technical hurdle is not there as much as the technical hurdle of making it affordable probably is, don't you think?
Yes. In fact, as you were saying this, I'm thinking to myself that some of these technical hurdles have already been catapulted over in the marketing world. I'm a big fan of digital marketing because, to me, it's a great metaphor for a lot of things, right? The customer journey is a good metaphor for like a patient journey, or an employee journey, or even a device product journey. And that is, you sort of get an idea of what the intentions and directions and motivations and interests are, and how it's going to behave, and what can you do. For example, in marketing, you want to encourage a customer to purchase a product, click on a link or something. So what are the nudges, what are the little incentives that are made apparent through data, through sensors, that'll allow a system to move to a more optimal outcome. So in marketing, the optimal outcome is the customer buys your product or something like this, but the optimal outcome in medicine will be, maybe, some proper medical behavior, the proper response in a device or a manufacturing plant will be to maybe reduce the operating temperature or reduce the load on the system so that it doesn't burn out. So all these kinds of things, basically, sort of real-time decision-making from data streams, I've seen the digital marketing people already sort of mastering that. Now, their data streams might be, relatively speaking, easy in the sense that it's, web analytics as opposed to sensor, 1,000 sensors on a device. I think about, jet engines and aircraft. Jet engines have, producing, every single engine produces several terabytes per hour. It's just a ridiculous amount of data coming off just a single kind of thing, an engine. And there's hundreds of thousands of such engines around the world. And so someone calculated once there's like a yottabyte of data or something generated every year just from aircraft engines. And that's just one type of device in the world. So I think we're going to see sort of sharing of knowledge and solutions across domains, which is, since I'm permitted to do that in my job, where I can sort of see what people are doing in maybe the marketing space, and then in the health space, and then in the, in the national security space, or in the energy or transportation space, all of a sudden I think, well, gee, that sort of use case looks sort of like this one over here. Let's see if we can just use some of the solutions that these other people are trying out.
That's really interesting you mentioned that. I don't know if you know this, but my team's entire background is in digital marketing, and sort of the solutions that we came up with, the challenges we were facing there pushed us into IoT. So I think you're right on that, nail on the head there, because the scale of things that we were dealing with were a real problem for us, particularly in digital marketing, social media analysis. And then as we encountered those challenges, we realized the next place that they were going to be a problem was in IoT. So I appreciate you saying that, because it makes me feel good about my decision, because I trust your judgment more than my own.
Well, I came to this conclusion by watching people like you. So I don't know if you know this, but if you follow my Twitter feed, occasionally I'll refer to the Internet of Things as the Internet of Context. And that's one of my firm beliefs, is that the best insights and understanding of how to take the next best action or next best decision in any context, in any domain or vertical, has to do with when you have enough contextual information to know what the right thing to do is. And so that contextual information in the modern world where you have sensors on everything, and sensors include social media. I mean, social networks are a sensor, right? They're a sensor on the sentiment of the population, of the world, of the people, of your customer. I think about, Super Bowl commercials and those companies that spend $4 million for a 30-second spot on the Super Bowl. And they're immediately, I'm sure, I have no doubt, immediately after those commercials aired, they're monitoring social media to see what the sentiment is. I mean, was their $4 million investment producing positive or negative sentiment for their brand? And so this idea of getting context from whatever the sensors are, that's enormous in marketing. But likewise, in any decision making, it's not just, for example, I always give the example of the stock market. I try to do a time series analysis on a particular stock in the stock market to predict whether it's going up or down, but that's completely useless because it's auto-regressive. That is to say, I only can sort of predict a future behavior based upon past patterns of behavior. However, if I look at how that stock responds to different market conditions or how a certain sector in the market is moving, maybe this moves down when the other one moves up, all that contextual information gives me far more insight than just the single stream of information from that single time series. So the context is critical. So I'm pushing for this idea of calling IoT now the Internet of Context.
That's really interesting. I have seen you refer to that before, but I don't think I appreciated what you meant by that until just now. And so I appreciate that explanation because it helps a lot. And I think that is true. And there are, from my personal experience, having worked heavily in both areas, there's an enormous overlap between social media behavior and modeling and both at a technical level, at a business level, at a process level, and IoT. And it's very interesting because you are just trying to get context of what is happening and then respond to that context in digital marketing, social media, as well as sort of IoT, digital twin. They're very similar. And I appreciate you seeing that, and it's very interesting to me, that term, because I think that is a great term, and I think it makes sense, because it's well beyond just things, right? There are many digital things that have no physical entity that sort of feed into the Internet of Things as well. So I like that term a lot. And I think maybe we can wrap up the podcast on that term. And are there any sort of further things you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
I just want to say that Internet of Context is the IOC, so maybe the International Olympic Committee might have argument with us, but I'm going for it.
Yeah, maybe. And people might get confused with ICO also and think we're talking about Bitcoin or blockchain.
Oh.
Yeah, so...
yeah, you'll get a lot more followers then.
Yeah, we have to figure out a way to switch that C and that O, and then we'll you and I will really be onto something there. But thank you. So thank you for teaching us about the Internet of Context.
I'm very happy to do so.